all of you, whether you have a lot of experience or a little bit. As Tamara mentioned, we're going to, in the future, do some breakout groups where we may break out people who have more experience and those who have less, to make sure that this is of the most benefit to all of you. But that was very interesting to see. And how many of you have never done advocacy before and this is brand new and you would just love to learn more, but like you're super beginner, super newbie? Raise your, okay, this is fair. That's a fair answer, Sandra. All right, I see some hands there. Yep, okay. All right, so we've got the whole spectrum here on the call, which is fantastic. We've got super experienced, brand new, and then lots and lots of you in the middle. And that, I think, is really exactly what we were going for. So thank you for doing that. We can go back to the PowerPoint. I don't want to belabor the presentation, but I do just want to provide you a little bit of some of what we at SchoolHouse Connection think are important principles, I guess, to keep in mind for any kind of advocacy we do. Of course, we're talking specifically about state today, but this would apply to anything we do. As a national organization, you know, we really listen to people in the field to help drive any of the policy we do. And that absolutely includes young people experiencing homelessness, parents. We'd like to do a better job than we do in terms of engaging parents. That's something that's kind of on our goal list going forward. I'm happy to say that I'm scrolling down our participant list, and I'm not going to call anybody out, but we have some of our outstanding scholars on this call today with us. So I'm super happy that they are here so that they can be part of this conversation as well. So, you know, I think any kind of policy, it's important to listen and to know what the real needs are. Many of you are on the front lines, you know exactly what the needs are. You're dealing with them every day. Others are perhaps at a state organization that might be a little bit further from direct service. So that listening piece, keeping things grassroots, particularly from our perspective, if we're doing state policy advocacy, we're really trying to be consensus-based. There might be things that people don't agree on, and that's okay. That's you know, perfectly fine. We can still all work together on the things that we do agree on. So if we're helping to put together a state policy agenda, we're always looking for, you know, if we have 100 people at the table, there's probably 100 things we can all agree on and maybe 10 that we don't. And so we're going to try to focus on those 100. And nonpartisan. And this is something that we really feel strongly about. And even in the little bit, the few states and achievements that Tamara just mentioned, you know, that $800 million for children, youth experiencing homelessness that just got passed a couple weeks ago, that was an amendment that was co-sponsored by Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, and Joe Manchin, a Democrat. So we really do try to work in a bipartisan manner. The state work that we do, we work in, you know, really red states and really blue states and really purple states. And I know all the people on this call represent the entire political spectrum as well. So those are things that are kind of touchstones for us. Looking at the next slide. So just to give you kind of an overview of where we've been busy. And we, you know, everything that we do, we're doing in partnership with other organizations. We don't do any state policy work by ourselves. I think that would actually be inappropriate, to be perfectly honest with you. As a national organization, we have to be working in partnership and taking our direction from people within those states. So, you know, we're really very fortunate to have colleagues all around the country. So just to give you kind of a snapshot of where we've been working over the past few years. On the next slide, I feel a little bit sad about Arizona on the next slide because it makes me feel, you know, I know Dawn and I, you're on the call and we worked really hard in Arizona, but we're going to change that color there as it's going to be a state where we worked on policy and did pass legislation. I know that that's going to happen. And then one thing that we've been really trying to do lately to do a lot more of is implementation. So, you know, for me, in my history of work, I've worked a lot on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the McKinney-Vento Act. And so, you know, a lot of my career has been focused on implementing those laws, helping schools to have the information, the resources, defending the rights of parents and youth. And so if we're going to be involved in passing a law at the state level, we also really want to stick around and try to help make sure that it gets implemented and try to provide that support and TA to the best that we can on that. So that's another thing that we're working on in some states now and really hoping to expand that work going forward. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, I guess, on our work is, you know, many of you on this call have been involved in what we call state advocacy institutes, which is kind of a process that we go through if we're working in a state to try to follow those principles that I mentioned earlier. So we want to listen, learn, advocate, grassroots consensus. And so we have a process that we go through for doing that. Our first step in that process is to solicit input directly from young people and from parents. And a lot of times we do that through a simple survey. We can often provide incentives or gift cards for people who give their time to complete that survey. Again, our partners are the ones who are really getting that out to young people and to parents. We also want to get input from practitioners, stakeholders of all kinds, from people like all of you who are on this call, people from all levels of education, community-based organizations, faith communities, everyone who considers themselves to be stakeholders in the issue of child and youth homelessness. And so we do that sometimes, again, through surveys, as well as through open stakeholder meetings. In normal times, we like to do those with a lunch or a breakfast and just have as many people as possible. Absolutely have young people there at those meetings with the group, so that it's a mixed group and everyone has the opportunity to speak and share their opinions. And like I said, kind of build that consensus around something that a policy agenda that everybody kind of feels good about. I was skimming over the whiteboard and looking at some of what you all typed around what brings you hope when you think about advocating for young people. And I know a lot of people mentioned the word momentum. A lot of people talked about just raising awareness, elevating voices to be heard in the halls of policymakers. And I think that is so important, and that's something that requires patience sometimes. You know, you don't always, certainly at the federal level, you never get anything done quickly. At the state level, you also often don't get anything done quickly. And so anything that this group can do to educate policymakers so that in the first place, they know that there is such a thing as child and youth homelessness in their community and in their state, which many policymakers do not know, and then educating them about what the needs are. So that can be a process that can take time and take patience, and things that you might consider to be failures. Actually, it's just a step towards success as policymakers get more and more educated. And then we try to be realistic with our policy agendas, knowing that some things are controversial, some things are expensive, some things are more or less likely to pass depending on the political persuasion of the legislature or the governor. But none of that is ever an excuse not to act, right? We all know that we've got to do everything we can as a community to support children and youth experiencing homelessness, and try to move things forward, you know, as realistically and as well as we can. So that's just a little bit about sort of how we look at advocacy from a very high level. I think what we want to do in this community practice is dig down deeper into some of these strategies and hear from each other about what's working, what's not working. But for the first session, we just kind of wanted to give you a higher level overview. And before we move on to the next slide, I would love to invite people again back into the chat box. For those of you who raised your hand in that first round, who said, you know, you've done policy, you feel pretty comfortable, you kind of understand the nuts and bolts of it. If you have ideas that you would like to share for what do you think about when you're doing policy? Who are some stakeholders, let's say, that you bring to the table that maybe we might not automatically think of? How are some ways that you educate policymakers about homelessness? If there are things that you've done in your community for policy advocacy that you think have worked well, I'd love for people to pop those into the chat box, or even feel free to unmute yourself and share something that you've done that you thought was really effective to educate policymakers, to push a bill forward, any best strategy that you want to share. It'd be great for us to learn from each other today. So feel free to pop that into the chat box, and then I'll share it out, or, you know, unmute yourself if you're bold enough. We'll leave you a second to do that before we move on.
I think providing data to show the numbers.
Data.
Have it be a data-driven decision.
Yeah, and I know you've done fantastic work on data, Sandra, in New Jersey, and collaborating with other partners too. That's great. And sorry, I think, was that Katara? Were you going to say something and I jumped on you? Sorry about
yes,
that.
I was going to second what Sandra said. I think data is absolutely important. And just kind of going back to an example you brought up of sometimes having failures, but those failures building on successes. You know, in our work, we've definitely had failures in Washington State, but being able to have data and show data allowed us to actually have success. And so one of the things that we've been able to do with data is create, partner with our State Department of Education to create a kind of a data analysis of students experiencing homelessness. And why that was really important is that there was this kind of myth within our state legislature that the numbers of students experiencing homelessness was inflated. So we have 40,000 students experiencing homelessness in our state. Many individuals tend to think that students who are temporarily sharing housing with others, that they're not technically or quote unquote literally homeless. And our data was able to show that students who are temporarily living with others have the same education outcomes as students who are quote unquote in cars, in shelters. And so we were able to kind of dismantle that myth and kind of open the eyes of legislators that, you know, this population is important, that there is a reason why the, you know, McKinney-Vento definition is so inclusive. And it did lead to some really great state policy changes. The other thing I will say to answer your question is that I do think we have to think about expanding our partners beyond maybe individual school districts and homeless liaisons. I think looking at, you know, teachers unions, sometimes professional education associations, we're trying to work with the Association of Washington State Principals, the Washington State School Directors Association, really educating them about the importance of students experiencing homelessness, because often liaisons don't have authority within the school district, right? And they're often not included in the planning at the school administration level. So as much as we can educate, you know, school administrators on the importance of this population and working with this population, I think that's critically important. So I'm gonna step back now, so I'm not talking too much, but I'm always happy to answer questions and brainstorm about the work we're doing in Washington.
Thanks, Katara. You in Washington have been like this rumble that started maybe 10 years ago, and it's just become, you know, this steaming train, and the policy victories that you have had are really astounding. And I know it's because of all those strategies that you were sharing. Lots of cool stuff is coming in the chat box. If anybody else wants to chime in verbally on the Zoom, please feel free to jump in. I'll be quiet for a sec.
Hey, Patricia, I would say, and I have to give full credit to my friend and colleague, Mark Heinert, who's a few squares away from me on the Zoom today. I think, you know, having youth testify in the state of North Dakota, we have some hard legislators to connect with, and not only having youth testify and tell very compelling stories, particularly youth who have had successes, right? And then in North Dakota, constituents can sit on the floor during the session, and we were able to pair one of the youth who testified with one of the hardest nuts to crack in the legislature and sat for the session. And that legislator who tried to cut funding ended up actually being the bill carrier and making one of the most impassioned speeches for the for the restoration of funds. So you never know what you can do when you actually bring our consumers right into the chamber.
You know, this is Mark. I want to just add one more tiny thing. We were lucky also that this young man mentioned he was interested in the military, and that particular, do you remember that, Cody? And that particular gentleman was he was a former military, and he really kind of jumped on that, and he kind of like took him under his wing as his new adoptive son. So it goes to show though that relationships matter. Those real personal connections make a difference, and having our young people be there. It's easier to turn down a request. It's harder when the young person's there and you don't see them as being a troublemaker.
Yeah, I have definitely been in hearings talking, and the legislators are like this, they're on their phones, and then a youth starts speaking and everything goes down, which is exactly as it should be. And the listening is different, and that's exactly as it should be.
The more you personalize stories, the more it's going to have an impact because it resonates with the person.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I had a very similar experience to what Cody shared, where we actually had a homeless liaison testify to a particular legislator who wouldn't even take a meeting with us. But we had this particular liaison who was in that legislator's district send a letter to him directly, as well as to the committee that he was on. And, he went from, not taking a meeting with us to actually on the floor giving a passion speech about why the policy was so important. So I just want to definitely second why personal stories and the stories of young people and the stories of liaisons are also so important. The other thing I just also want to share too is just in terms of the hope question is that we've seen how powerful it is when we have policies supporting students experiencing homelessness. And we've had school districts tell us, particularly a superintendent say that, we've never seen a policy work in the way that it was intended in such a powerful way. And we know that when we have supports for our students experiencing homelessness, that, individual capacity within school districts, that it makes a huge difference in their education outcomes. We've seen school districts that have, state support for our students experiencing homelessness, graduation rates skyrocket for our student population. We have some school districts that are benefiting from a grant program that we have in Washington State for students experiencing homelessness, whose graduation rates have gone from, like 60% to 80%. And when we look at the statewide graduation rates of students experiencing homelessness, which is about 59% right now, that's a huge, difference. And so we know that when we put resources to our students experiencing homelessness, it actually does chip away at the education gap. We talk a lot about equity in our, working with students or whatnot, but our students are often the students that are furthest from education justice. And when we look at the data, particularly we know in our state that over 62% of students experiencing homelessness, so that's over 25,000 of 40,000 students who are students of color. And so, we have an opportunity to really kind of drive the conversation towards why we need to possibly think about targeted universalism strategies. And when we focus on our populations, we are really trying to improve outcomes really for all students. And so that gives me hope and that gives me excitement about why this work is so important.
Thank you all for sharing. This is great. I am going to introduce Jordan Rourke. Turn it over to Jordan. She is going to discuss best practices in adult youth collaboration. And then also at the end of the session, we'll have more time for Q&A and comments as well.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I will preface by saying I am healing from being sick, so I am going to sound kind of scratchy. I hope you can hear me and understand me okay, though. As she mentioned, my name is Jordan. I'm the Director of Youth Leadership and Scholarships with SchoolHouse Connection. So I have the incredible opportunity to work every day with young people around the country who have experienced homelessness and who are pursuing higher education. And earlier this year, we had a conversation as a team where we were trying to think, what are the best practices for engaging young people, especially young people that have lived experience, whether it be homelessness or some other traumatic experience? How do we ensure that the engagement is beneficial to them? How do we ensure that our organization really thinks through things? How do we ensure that it's safe? And how do we ensure that we're hearing the full story and engaging a diverse range of youth? And so that's kind of what I want to touch on today. We don't have a ton of time. This is actually a really long resource that we just recently released. It's like 16 pages, I think, and it goes in depth from start to end. If you want to engage a young person, like many of you mentioned, in testifying, for example, how do you do that? From the very beginning of thinking of doing it to getting feedback from them after the fact. So we're going to touch on some of them today, and then we're also going to be offering a full webinar coming up. We haven't selected the date yet. Just keep an eye on your email where we're going to go in depth through each one of these principles as well. It'll be available in the resource immediately after this presentation. These principles came from my own experience as an unaccompanied homeless youth in childhood, from my work now, as I mentioned, but more importantly, from what we've learned from our scholars and our students and what has helped them and some things that have hurt them, as well as from our Education Leads Home team has helped with developing these principles. The first one that we mentioned was drafting a partnership description. So before you engage a young person, this bullet point is all about thinking through what that engagement's going to look like and getting into the real nitty gritty of it. So sitting down with your team and saying, okay, we want to engage a young person. How long do we want to engage them? Is this a one-time engagement, or is it going to last, say, a month, 2 months, a longer-term partnership? Are we looking for a specific age, gender, experience? Are we looking for a parenting student and an unaccompanied homeless youth, someone in a rural community? What are we going to ask of them? Are we asking them to write, to speak, to join calls? How's it going to benefit them? Are we able to pay them? You know, we always suggest paying a living wage if possible. So what are our resources to pay them? What other benefits going to come out of it? Is it a resume builder for them? Are they going to be able to do an internship with us? Are they going to be able to be mentored? Like, kind of, what is that going to look like? And why are we as an organization doing it? What's our intention? So are we looking to learn and improve our practices? Are we looking to get feedback on our current program? Are we looking to get an impact statement or a story to utilize in testifying or things of that nature? There's other things you want to think about, but these are just some examples. You want to really sit down and get all of this on paper, really think through it. And this will help both to clarify for the youth if it's a good opportunity for them, but it also helps you as an organization set the intention of why you're doing it and the importance of it. After you do that, it's important to build community partnerships to identify and engage youth participants. So the key piece here is warm transfer referrals. So oftentimes we engage young people that maybe we're not in close contact with, especially if we're working like at the state level, or if we are the liaison, we've met the student one time, but we don't work with them regularly this year, you know, like things like that. We may not know students that well. And so this is where those community partnerships come in handy. So take that partnership description that you created and share that out to the social workers, the counselors, the teachers, whoever's applicable that may know young people that are in a place to do this opportunity. That way, that person that has the relationship with that young person can have this conversation and say, hey, this is an opportunity that you could potentially participate in. Can we talk through if it's a good time in your life to do that, if it's safe for you to do that, and if you feel like you have the time and capacity? There's no pressure there for the young person to say yes, because it's not us coming in as a stranger saying, oh, there's a super cool opportunity, do it. You know, they're with someone they know and they can feel safe enough to say no if it's not right for them. If it is right for them, that then allows for that warm transfer referral. So that person that they already know can connect them with you via a three-way phone call, an email chain, a text chain, whatever is applicable. And that allows the young person to have their safety person there meeting someone maybe they don't know. Now that person that they're meeting that they don't know, we want that to be a contact person within your organization, program, whatever is applicable. And we want it ideally to be someone that has some type of background, whether it be in social work, psychology, education, lived experience is great. Something, some type of knowledge to make sure that they're able to be a support person to this young person as they're engaging in the organization. And that takes us into building relationships and rapport. So when you connect with a young person, it's critical to first get to know them before we jump into logistics, right? That's what we would do with anyone that we're engaging that we may not know. And so we often suggest doing an informal phone call, the person of contact in your organization, just scheduling a phone call and just chatting and getting to know the young person. I'm going to tie in the next bullet, which is making an effort to understand and value youth as partners and partners as individuals. So, you know, I think all of us on this call understand that homelessness is an experience. It's not an identity. And young people bring their entire selves to the table. And it is our downfall if we don't recognize that. So, you know, young people bring a lot of interest, a lot of expertise beyond just their expertise of their experience of homelessness. And so it's in our benefit, and it is the best practice to get to know them as a whole human being. And that first phone call can start to facilitate that. After that, we suggest having frequent check-in calls, as frequent as is applicable, to check in and see how whatever the partnership looks like is going with the young person. We also try to diversify how we contact young people. So like I have a work Snapchat account, I have a work Instagram account, I have a work WhatsApp. Like I have all these things that are just work accounts where I communicate with young people that way. I have some young people that only communicate with me over Snapchat because that's what they like, and that's totally okay. And you know, obviously you have to do what is applicable and appropriate within your role. You may not be allowed to have a Snapchat, but do what you can to diversify your communication options with young people, because they're getting a lot of emails and they might not want to get more from you, and they might not have the space or capacity to respond to something like that. So continuing on with making an effort to understand and value them as individuals, the only last piece that I wanted to mention there is encouraging feedback throughout the entire process. So we talked about drafting a partnership description. Have them read that and give feedback on that. If there's something in the partnership description they think could be improved on, start the feedback there, change the partnership description. And that person of contact should be that facilitation point for open feedback. So it should be a safe space where the youth can give critiques like, you know, I didn't really feel supported here, I really needed this, or they can just give positive feedback or feedback of changes that they would like made in whatever the partnership area is. And that's just part of, like I said, building that relationship and getting to know them. Regularly communicating and providing ample information. So we want to respect students' schedules. We all know that, you know, oftentimes our students are full-time in school, a lot of them are full-time working, they're very busy. And so making sure that we send information as early as possible. I've had students that have spoken for organizations that have gotten their materials super, super last minute. And the amount of anxiety that that has caused them has been just, I mean, astronomical. And that's not okay. That's not okay, especially when young people are sharing their vulnerable stories, right? Because they already probably are feeling some of that. So we need to make sure that we provide as much information as we possibly can. One of the big examples that I give in the resource is when a young person first joins your organization, maybe you have them join a conference call, but maybe that conference call has a lot of acronyms usually. Like maybe like COC meetings, for example, how many acronyms are in COC meetings, right? It's crazy. So let's say you have a young person join a COC meeting. It's not going to make sense to them. It's going to be really defeating. So, you know, maybe you ask everyone on the call, say, we have a new person joining this call that's not familiar with our acronyms. Please do not use acronyms. Or if you do, clarify what the acronym means when you share it. Or if that is not an option, which it should be, but if it's not, give a key terms list to the young person beforehand and say, don't stress it, but these are the acronyms if you're curious what they mean. Right? This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, thinking it through. They're not common sense things, but it's things that will help the young person and anyone engaging feel comfortable. Moving forward, to be sensitive of time, providing support during in-person events and moderating panels intentionally. I want to just very vaguely touch on this. So, you know, for example, with this, you want to ask the young person every question you can think of to support them beforehand. So where do you want me to stand in the room if the young person's going to be speaking? Is it most helpful if I sit in the front row, or am I going to make you nervous? Should I stand in the back? Should I stand by the door? Should I stand right beside you? As your person of contact, what would be the best support for you? Would you like me to hold up a 5-minute left sign? What's your favorite snack and drink that I could bring you? And whatever you agree to, whatever the young person shares, you need to do. And that's the most important part, is you need to follow through on what you say you're going to do. So if you say you're going to sit in the front row, you're in the front row, probably 5 minutes early. Right? We want to show that consistency because that's critical to the relationship building with anyone, but especially young people that maybe have some traumatic experiences. Moderating panels, you know, this really goes back to like send the questions ahead of time, explain roughly how much time each young person or each person on the panel has to answer a question. A lot of times I'll have my students presenting on panels and they're like, I don't know how long to speak. Like it makes me anxious because I don't want to talk too long. And so giving like, you know, give X amount of questions, it leaves us roughly this amount of time per answer. With some of my panels with young people, we decide to go down a line instead of just opening it up to the floor, because it makes them more comfortable to know who's supposed to speak when. And what our kind of rule of thumb that they know is if someone doesn't say anything for a couple seconds, that signals they don't want to speak and they just move down the line, right? So it's a set line, and that reduces the anxiety there. And you know how we found that out? Was I asked them. I had a panel, I had a congressional briefing of young people, and I asked them on the prep call what would be the most helpful, right? And so that's what you can always defer to, is asking. They know, they're the experts in the room. Moving on, audience boundaries and Q&A time. It's what it sounds like. Always be there to help moderate Q&A. Sometimes some weird questions come up when students are speaking. Sometimes they can be triggering. Sometimes they can be inappropriate. We want to be there to help defer those, to help answer them if we need to for students, or answer them as an organization, things like that. We want to make sure that we are supporting them, because that can be a really stressful situation for students as well. And then with audience boundaries, whenever I present with students in person, I always emphasize that we as an organization respect physical boundaries. And we always ask people what they're most comfortable with, whether it be a handshake, a high five, fist bump, or a hug. Because oftentimes, I know me, when I was a student speaking, I would speak at conferences and have the most well-intentioned people come up and immediately hug me right after. And it was really, really overwhelming, and oftentimes not what I wanted. And so making sure, I literally will say it to the audience, I'll ask them to ask students or defer to speaking, not typing. Engaging multiple youth and parents over time to provide diverse perspectives. No one student has the whole story of homelessness, and we all know that. Every single one of us knows that, right? No one student's story can be generalized to all experiences. And so it's critical that as we engage youth, we engage multiple youth, and youth that have diverse perspectives, and diversity in terms of everything: rural, urban, gender, sexual orientations, age of homelessness, length of homeless, you know what it is. Make sure that we're doing this as much as we possibly can. And then lastly, gathering feedback from youth to inform partnerships. So we want to make sure at the end of the partnership that we continue that feedback process, and we say, like, hey, we're kind of new at this, right? And we're trying to figure out how best to engage youth. What would have been more helpful for you? What were things maybe we could have added or done differently? Was there anything we did that wasn't helpful? And be open to that, because we are all learning. This best practices that we created, we call it a work in progress document, a live document, because we're learning. There are things I could learn from every single one of you, right? And so that's how we want to present ourselves to young people as well, because it's true, we are. And then one bullet point that's not on here that I want to mention is utilizing youth that have previously engaged with you that are now older, or maybe beyond their experience of homelessness, or whatever it means for your organization, as mentors for new students. So whether it be connecting one specific older student with a younger student, or just having that mentor as a resource for all students. But we utilize peer resources in our organization, and it can be incredibly helpful to have young people that have not only experienced homelessness, but have been a scholarship recipient or been a youth partner, to be able to say, hey, I've done a congressional briefing before, and it was so scary. Like, are you scared? Like, talk to me about it. And the young person a lot of times is, much more willing to be open to someone that's been there. And so you can utilize, youth that have previously engaged in that way as well to continue the relationship. So this was so much, I know, it was so many bullets. We're going to be doing the full webinar coming up soon, but for the sake of time, I want to go ahead and transition over to Mark, and then we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about your experiences with youth partnerships.
Okay, is that us? When you say Mark, you're talking about me and being able to talk about what we're doing in North Dakota? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate all of the good insight. I actually have been kind of double timing it a little bit these last couple of days. The National Network is also putting on a conference, as many of you know, and I just have to take off on what Jordan said, because we're fortunate enough at YouthWorks to have one of our Youth Advisory Board members be a part of the National Network's Advisory Board. And one of the messages that was shared in that particular conference absolutely rings true with what Jordan was saying right now, which is, even during times of COVID, we're not interested in being tokens. We're not interested in being on the board for the sake of being able to say you can write a grant and say we have youth that are on our board. We're not interested in being a part of this process unless it's a real meaningful process. And so Patricia asked us if we could just kind of discuss some of the things that we had done and the process that she led us through towards some policy changes. So as Cody referred to early on, we've got a pretty good history of involving youth in going to the state legislature to advocate on behalf of different issues. This particular time, we spent 2 years really getting a team of individuals together, including the policy makers, the stakeholders, and the youth themselves. The most boisterous were certainly the young people themselves, and clearly they had the best examples. And so we We had a series of meetings where we identified some of the challenges, some of the issues, talked about what makes sense within our own state, also acknowledged and realized some of the financial pitfalls associated with where we were in our state. And so, and I know Cody and Beth are on too, so feel free to jump in and correct me or add more to how I'm presenting this. Anyway, so we really landed on some of the policy issues that did not involve funding. So the vital records, the healthcare access to shelter care, were things that were not necessarily going to cost money and could yet get attention to the issues of homeless youth. So it was really beneficial during the process to have some of the same youth. I think what happens when you have a 2-year plan though is sometimes some of the youth that started aren't necessarily there at the end. And so even when it came to gaining some help from young people doing the testifying, gaining that support to provide that level of information, which I think is natural, and it's important to share this. We had some individuals who moved out of our community, but we reached out to them again when it came time for us to go to the legislature, when it came time for us to have some of those specific conversations with policymakers, because they really were the ones that had the fire in their belly in the front end in the beginning and helped identify those issues. And so we might have had young individuals that were still interested in being a part of it, but it was also important, we felt, that we have someone who understood that process that the group went through. So I think even when you think of like what could have been done a little bit differently with our process, it might be that is how do we keep youth engaged for a longer haul? So we started it, we knew we were 2 years away from when it was going to be implemented. And we had youth be a part of it the entire way through, but we didn't necessarily have some of the consistent youth that were there through that whole process, just because of their own reaching their own levels of independence, moving on, or just being less interested or less connected, which happens certainly at time. The other benefit that we had in our state, which many other states are also small like ours, but because our population is pretty low, we happen to be, I know Patricia likes to say, like, I still can't get over you guys calling your senators like by their first names. I can't quite adjust to that. So it's really true. So Aaron, who's one of our state senators, is someone who happens to be on the board of the organization I work with. And we did a hunger and homeless awareness event 3 years ago. And this particular event, we had our youth volunteering for it. And there was a big open house associated with this for a permanent supportive housing project that got the lieutenant governor, the mayor, a lot of dignitaries were there, including state senators, et cetera. So we had a fantastic opportunity. I didn't open my mouth. Our young people were like, you need to join this group we're starting. We're working on these policy issues. And sure as heck, we had people at the table who were more movers and shakers and policymakers, decision makers. And it didn't require me reaching out to make it. I got to be a part, Cody got to be a part, Beth got to be a part of helping the communication process. But it really mattered that it was a real key that the request specifically came from a young person asking them to do it. And I even joked with Erin, who's the state senator later, saying, hey, are you coming to that meeting? She said, yeah, not because you invited me, but because the kids invited me. That's why I came to that. So I think that was another, blessing for us, is that we had that opportunity to, let our young people make that ask. We have the opportunity to have relationships that oftentimes are more personal because we are, from smaller communities. And then the other thing that I think was advantageous for us, and don't blush Patricia too much, but the reality is Patricia knows her shit. And really, 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 like, there's times where I'm going, I'm not sure, what do we say, and Patricia's got the opportunities to know all of everybody on this call has offered their expertise about what they're doing in different states. And for you, Patricia, to also be able to say, well, here's what I know they're doing here, and this is what's happened here. And I haven't seen that be a problem in the other 20 states that have done this same thing. Really provided a greater amount of credibility. So we had the relationships, we have the young people, you know, but it really, in my opinion, takes all of those pieces together in order to have it be successful. And even when you're met with resistance, to be able to have enough young people that will be heard, to have enough of the people in my level that understand the state and on an administrative level, and enough experts that can say, well, actually, that's not true. And when you get those things in place, I think it's much easier to see some policies be implemented. And I think a line that I used this last time when we were testifying is that it doesn't seem like it's too much to ask. Like, young people just want access to their own records and they want to be able to get health care for themselves. It seems like a fairly simple, that was one of the asks that we had. But even being able to put that into perspective for the legislators, that it seems like it's not too much. You know, is this something that you think is too much to ask? Made them have to kind of think about that as a, well, yeah, it really isn't. The only resistance I think we had was who's going to pay for it. In terms of the healthcare access, that was one of the challenging questions that came up, was who's going to pay for it? And, you know, as soon as we're able to get to the level of understanding that there is a medical assistance program that will indeed still provide the coverage, it would work out really well. One thing we did not do that landed in our lap of luck, I think, I'm not really sure if this was someone behind the scenes and we weren't aware of it, but the State's Hospital Association saw the legislation and appeared and testified in support of access to health care. And I don't know, Patricia, if you know, or Cody or Beth, like, I know I wasn't making any calls. I just, when they were there, it was like, oh, I hope they're in favor, you know. And then when they, you know, began testifying and provided excellent support. So that might have been maybe a misstep on our behalf by not thinking of that. So that's something else others could learn from. Is it was very helpful when we were looking.
They used their template.
Yeah.
They were using the correct template.
They really were. But
it was the one Patricia sent out. So.
But Beth, you didn't call them, right? I mean, just to be clear, like we didn't initiate.
No, there was some discussion in regards to, okay, where's a template that I can utilize, which Patricia then did send us, and I did send out 2 liaisons and some of our members.
So,
but it was verbatim her template.
So it was that we did it, but we did it indirectly and didn't realize it because it wasn't just sending it straight to someone and asking them. So anyway, I think that's a potential growth point, though, is to consider, you know, who else. We thought we had a lot of people involved. We really did have a lot of stakeholders, but that actually was not one of the stakeholders that was there through the whole process. And at the end, they actually were key in their testimony. So I think that's a relatively quick summary of kind of what we've been doing. And is there anything else, Patricia, that would be helpful for us to kind of share on this?
I don't think so. I think that was extremely helpful. I hear Beth maybe wanting to chime something in. I know you put a couple of things in the chat box.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on 2 things. I think the amount of individuals that were involved with the statewide group, I know that it ebbed and flowed, but Patricia does know her stuff, and it really added legitimacy to everything. I mean, she knew tons of stuff in all areas that spoke to some of these agencies coming to the table. So I think that they were informed in regards to what our state was facing, and also that Patricia had that experience across states. And then I just want to say again, as always, key is to, you know, pay those youth because they are consultants. They are key consultants, and that is important. And I think that in North Dakota, we have been trying to push and figure out a way for them to not be just getting a gift card, but, you know, an actual wage because of their expertise.
Definitely. And I see in the chat box, I don't want to put you on the spot, Deborah. I don't even know if you're still on the call. If you want to unmute yourself and talk about the comment you made in the chat box, I think that comment resonated with a lot of people. If you want to do that, obviously no pressure.
Sure. Can you hear me, Patricia?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So I was just commenting that oftentimes I live in Florida, so I often say that one of the negatives when you ask students, or not us, but when people ask students, youth to tell their stories, they do it almost like they're Mickey and Minnie Mouse. I want you to tell your story, and then great, give them a hug and walk away. And you cannot do that. You can't be tokenized. You have to really, first of all, listen to their story, but then allow them to make decisions. Allow them to be part of that process. The Youth Homeless Demonstration Grant through HUD is crucial with that. Making sure that that youth explain what worked for them in best practices, what don't work for them, because oftentimes that goes away without anyone talking further. And then to Jordan's point, paying them is very important, not just a living wage, but more than a living wage. And by doing that, you're showing them that they are important and their voice is important. I think that was a comment you were speaking about. Yes, Patricia?
Yes, thank you very much.
No problem.
We have actually since then too, we are as a part of our plan, each meeting that a young person attends, they're going to receive a $50 stipend. And so in terms of something more than the living wage and something that really compensates them for their time, we feel like we're in the right place right now to be able to give that to them. And that's whether that's a 2-hour meeting or a 1-hour meeting, is kind of more like, but you pulled yourself out, that's time that matters. So.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mark, Beth, Deborah, for your comments, and Mark specifically for your presentation. I just wanted to open the floor up to any questions or additional comments that folks had. I also know that I think we have some scholars on the line, some of our youth partners. So I didn't know if they wanted to either in the chat or unmute themselves and kind of share their thoughts. I'm sure everyone would be really happy to hear those.
I'm doing my teacher pause to allow other people to speak, but there was something that Mark said that resonated for me, and that was about the hospital association speaking for the medical consent bill, because our friends from the Nevada Partnership for Homeless Youth, Arash Ghafouri and Melissa Jacobowitz, are at the National Network for Youth Conference, so they're not here, but we're working on also on a minor medical consent bill there in Nevada. And they did reach out to some healthcare partners and got them also to testify for the bill. And it was such a huge support. And so that just kind of gets me back to a comment that I think Beth made and someone else made about just, so many different people and organizations are stakeholders on this issue of child and youth homelessness. And I think sometimes we kind of think about the same small group of people, and we don't necessarily think about all the different people in all the different walks of life who have a really vested interest in this and really, really care about it and would love to be involved and would love to be helpful if we asked them and gave them that opportunity. Because I know the nurses who testified were really excited about it and really felt very passionate about the bill. And so, Arash did a great job, as he always does, of getting people around the table and to support it. So that just made me think of kind of Beth's comment too of, we really have to open this conversation up as much as we possibly can to lots of people who aren't normally at the table. Especially at the state level where, you do know your legislators, you do serve on boards with them and maybe go to the same synagogue or church as them, or, you went to high school with their cousin. And so, the more people you have around the table, the more those connections can come to light too.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're really good on time, guys. We have until about 4:25 for any sort of just general questions or comments for Mark, Jordan, or Patricia, and also just for the group in general. So feel free to include those in the chat or unmute yourself.
I don't know if I'm allowed to put somebody on the spot again. I put Deborah on the spot, and I don't know, Katara, if you're going to allow me to put you on the spot, and just ignore me if you don't want to talk. But I know you had mentioned that you'd be happy to discuss what you've all done around compensation, equitable compensation for young people, parents, and liaisons.
Yeah, absolutely. So we often, when we are either thinking about our policy that we put forth, the organization I work with, we don't just do policy, we also do, we often partner with government agencies and other nonprofits to provide technical assistance. And so an example of kind of what we've done, particularly when COVID happened, we developed an emergency fund with the Office of Homeless Youth and some of our philanthropy partners. And in that work, we made sure that we included young people as well as families to really inform how we were setting up this grant and how we were distributing dollars to school districts so that we were ensuring that we were meeting the needs that schools actually had. But in that work, we are always ensuring that we are compensating young people fairly for their time. And it's not just young people, it's parents, even liaisons, whoever we interact with, we do make sure that we are providing fair compensation. And I don't necessarily have all the details. I'm happy to bring in others, particularly two of my colleagues who were former liaisons in their school districts, and they can really share even more details about what they've done to not only engage liaisons and young people, but how to ensure that that's done equitably in a way that is fair. And I think someone hit the nail on the head when they said it's beyond just a living wage. It's about, you know, what's equitable, because, and I think the same person, I think it might have been Beth, who said that, you know, young people and parents are consultants and we really need to be paying them, you know, the same amount that we would pay a professional consultant. But really just, you know, happy to talk about, you know, what infrastructure that we put in place to do that. But I also think that an important thing that we'll also need to talk about as a group is how do we, you know, get the funding to be able to do that work, right? Because a lot of times all of us, I'm assuming, are working with very limited amounts of dollars. And how do we ensure that, you know, we are able to compensate, you know, individuals who are helping inform our work fairly. So.
Thank you for that.
I just saw a really good chat. So there's a question that came in that says, when a lot of bills and legislation is coming through our local state legislature, how do you not overwhelm the youth you're working with, especially around testifying or sharing their story? You strategize on which ones are important. And I think this question is incredibly important, right? Because we want to make sure that our young people are safe and that it's not re-traumatizing and that it's not overwhelming and that they're able to still have the capacity to do what they need to do in their daily life, because oftentimes they are still grinding long hours, whether it be for school or work or whatever it is. And so I think, you know, two-part here is yes, strategizing on what is most important. I get inundated a lot of times with requests for student speakers. And I really have to think about which ones are A, most appropriate, and B, most important in that moment. But also, this is where engaging multiple youth can come in handy and continuing the relationship beyond that initial engagement. So, you know, we have peer leaders that are well out of school. We have some that are older than me that still engage and speak for us. And so continuing those relationships, you begin to develop this like core of young people, of parents that you can draw on, so you aren't constantly having to draw on the same students to share their story over and over. But I think in terms of recognizing when it's becoming too much comes out of the relationship you have with the young person and the line of communication that you have with them. Because that's the conversation, that's part of my role, is kind of gatekeeping the students, not gatekeeping, but like providing that barrier from the students and the opportunity so that they can say like, no, man, I've got an exam this week. Like, I can't do that. And I don't even mention their name to the news people or whoever. They don't even know the student exists. but that's me as the social worker that I'm like, do you want me to connect you, right? So I think having that line of communication can be key. And also using our own professional insight to recognize if a student is starting to show signs of being re-traumatized, starting to withdraw, starting to experience some heavy emotions, things like that. That's also on us to a certain extent as well. I hope that made sense. I don't know if anyone else has anything to share on that or any experiences with that, but I think it's a really important point.
Jordan, I do have a question for you. Have the young people ever possibly given trainings to maybe partners or legislative staff on adultism? Because I have definitely seen incidences where young people were being re-traumatized in kind of a state agency or a legislative session based on the questions that either state administrators were asking. And I don't mean just McKinney-Vento state administrators. I mean state administrators across the board or legislators are asking out of their own ignorance, for lack of a better term. And I know that the Office of Homeless Youth received a training, for example, on adultism from an organization called Mockingbird. And I was just wondering, have the youth we worked with engaged in those kind of trainings?
Yeah, not that I know of. And I think that that's a really, really important point because, you know, you just made me reflect a lot because like this whole time we've been talking about like protecting students from these uncomfortable questions that may be asked or protecting them from the re-traumatization when potentially we could prevent it from occurring at all. And not even, you know what I mean, to a certain extent, stop the questions, teach the people asking questions to ask better questions. And so I think you bring up a really powerful point of providing that youth-led training of what can be re-traumatizing. So that's something I want to keep talking about. But I don't know, Patricia, if you have any more information, but I don't think that's something we've done a whole lot of at this point.
No, I don't think so. Not exactly the way that Qatar is framing it. Yeah, I don't think that we've done that. I think it's more like you said, where, you know, I think that the young people that we work with have trained us, but I don't think we've taken that necessarily outside of our organization specifically on that issue of, you know, appropriate interactions between adults and youth. Our young people do lots and lots of trainings, and I think the resilience training that we've done touches on that a little bit, but it's not exactly that.
And one of the things I was just going to say, one of the things that I was going to mention before we started the Q&A was I would love to hear from any and all of you. Feel free to flood my email inbox with any experiences that you have had working with young people that A, went well, or B, did not go well. As you read the resource, if you're like, oh, you sound tone deaf here, or oh, you really missed this point, or oh, it'd be great if you added this, I want to know that. I desperately want to know that because, like I said, this is a live document. We're only going off of what we know. And so, you know, I may not be able to join this call every time it happens, but my email is open and I want to learn from you all.
Thank you, Jordan. And we definitely want to learn from you as well, because you have a lot of great information to share.
You know, Bianette's comment, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Bianette, is about overwhelming young people, was a reflection that I was giving on one of our staff meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago about how the pandemic has changed kind of the logistics of our work. And, you know, this year, every legislature really is on Zoom. You know, everything's virtual. And previously, it was such a chore for young people and adults, for all of us, to like go to the legislature and sit there for 5 hours while we're waiting them to get to our bill. It takes a whole day out of your schedule. You know, for young people who have class and work, they can't just go and sit there for 5 hours. It's not their job like it is our job. And so it being on Zoom has been so great and so much easier. And I'm already kind of dreaming next year. And that just made me think of that idea of thinking about what's important. You know, you can't ask a young person to go and sit in the state legislature for 5 hours waiting for a bill to be heard, and they're thinking about the anxiety that someone's dealing with that whole time, waiting for to testify, and at the same time they've got class, they've got work, they've got other things, and so I definitely agree with being strategic on, we think this hearing is going to go pretty well, so we're not going to tax anybody. Other day, we'll wait until a day when we really need people, and then we'll, try to, again, provide them with adequate support, compensation, et cetera, to hopefully give them the ability to do that.
I also find sometimes that diversifying the options for engagement is nice. We have some students that would love to testify. We have other students that is their worst nightmare. But those students might want to join this call and sit and talk to us about it later. They might want to write a blog. They might want to, do things like that. And so I think diversifying their options for engaging and sharing their expertise can be really helpful to ensure that they're doing what they're most comfortable with, but also being able to partner to the highest extent.
Okay, if there are not any other questions, I don't want to rush us or anything. We do have until 4:30. But if there are not any other questions or comments or tips folks want to share, I would love to see if Patricia, Jordan, and Mark had any final comments they wanted to share with the group.
Oh, this is Mark. I've got a quick one. Just invite the young people and just get out of their way. And figure out how you can ride their coattails, because their energy will carry the process, and that's the best thing I would say is really let's take advantage of youth and the engagement that they already are providing for us.
Yeah, I feel like I've shared like 10 final thoughts in the last 15 minutes, but maybe the biggest one is the relationship. That I think is what comes if you do nothing else. If you don't ever read the resource or do nothing else, take time to get to know the young person and listen to them, because they will provide to a certain extent the guidance that's needed. Now, it's still on your back to not re-traumatize as professionals, but they will help tell you what they need if you have the relationship with them. And so listen if you don't do anything else.
That's such a good point. Okay, so I thought I was just going to say one thing, but I want to play off on that too, because it's one thing to do that, but then it's also like, I'll be there with you. I'm going to sit with you. I'm going to guide you. Don't worry. I'll, whether it be going to a meeting or testifying or any of that process, is them knowing that you're really there with them in that process. So you're not going to sign them up for something and then wish them good luck, but you're going to actually be there the whole time with them.
I have nothing to say that can top what Jordan and Mark just said.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. We're thrilled with the turnout and the conversation, the questions for this first session of our community of practice. We look forward to seeing you in Thursday, May 13th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. again, Eastern time. And we will be discussing data, statistics, and the needs of special populations. So this was great. Thank you and take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.